Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Conservationists Assemble podcast, the show that seeks to unite Earth's mightiest advocates in a mission to ensure a future for our planet's incredible habitats and its awesome inhabitants. I am your host, Johnny Bloxham, and this episode is a conversation on the road that led to modern zoos as we know them today. We'll be highlighting the role of modern zoos and what zoos of the future should look like, and how the world would fare without good zoos contributing to species survival. Join the podcast and our expert guest Douglas Richardson as we uncover what zoos can and are striving to achieve to ensure the future of the planet's species and a better planet for all. Doug has been an instrumental figure in driving standards of modern ex situ conservation forward around the world, having worked at some of the biggest names in ex situ conservation globally, such as ZSL London Zoo, Royal Zoological Society of Scotland's Highlands Wildlife Park and Edinburgh Zoo, and Singapore Zoo. He now spends his time as a zoo consultant travelling the world, providing his knowledge and expertise in continuing to drive zoo standards forward. Please welcome Doug as he joins the ranks of the Conservationists Assemble initiative to input his passion, knowledge and expertise on the future of zoos in conservation. Doug, thank you for your time and joining us on the podcast today. How's life treating you?
Very well, thank you.
Great. It's great to have you here. I'm excited to talk about everything that we're going to discuss today. And before we get into it, could you just give the listeners a bit more information on yourself?
Right. I started working in zoos in October 1975 as a keeper at Edinburgh. And I've, since that point, basically worked in, maybe 13, 14 different collections around the world, including the Bronx Zoo, Singapore, a private facility in British Columbia, Rome Zoo, a number of zoos in the UK from, as I said, Edinburgh, but Dudley, Howlett's, London Zoo. So basically, I've got a fairly, I suppose zoos are in my DNA, I would guess. Yeah.
And what are you up to now?
Well, since November 2018, I opted to step away from managing an animal collection, and because I was, for the 10 years prior to that, I was running the animal department at the Highland Wildlife Park in Scotland. And I decided, I'd had a number of colleagues that had suggested it, but I eventually decided for a variety of reasons to go self-employed. And so I became a jet-setting zoo consultant. And that has worked out very well and is incredibly interesting and very enjoyable. So it kind of suits me.
Fantastic. Yeah, I suppose it gets to like say, see a bit more of the world and see some more of the amazing collections that are around the world.
Well, I mean, this is it. And my clients are global in scope, from the UK to a number of collections out in Asia, having worked in the Mideast as well. So it's and a lot of projects for places that I'd never been before, which is always exciting for me, and helping to, for want of a better term, for some of these collections to drag them kicking and screaming, if not into the 21st century, at the very least the 20th century.
Today we're here to talk about the role of zoos. So could you please just tell us about how animals appeared in captivity compared to zoos as we know them today?
Do you mean about how zoos acquired animals historically? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, how we came to have, these animals from far off lands in the UK, for example.
Okay, it's actually it might be historic, but it's actually a very pertinent question today, because of, for want of a better term, zoological wokeism. we now have a number of people working in the zoo community that have a real problem with animals coming from the wild. And they seem to not realize that, the chimpanzees or the gorillas or the elephants or whatever it might be that they're working with, in many cases, they themselves did not come from the wild, but certainly their ancestors did. And it might only be one or two generations ago. So I suppose the main difference was that prior to a lot of international legislation, zoos were quite happy just to, refill their enclosures from the wild. There was an element of interzoo trade. Obviously, breeding was not as prevalent historically. And I'm talking basically before the late 1960s, really. That's when it really started to change. So you had situations where some zoos that might be able to tap into sourcing other species from the wild, and they'd maybe bring in four polar bears, two they'd keep, and two they'd use to trade with a zoo in North America or Asia or whatever for whatever they were looking for. So there was a more of a trade, either working with animal dealers, who obviously were supplied by animal trappers, or zoos themselves were very much reliant upon either selling animals, excuse me, or exchanging them. And the idea of animal loans or breeding loans or coordinated breeding programs is really a relatively recent part of the evolution of zoos and how that animal acquisition has changed. So now, basically, the vast majority of your animals come from other zoos.
Mhm. And that's, with that legislation then means that it's not possible to take animals from the wild anymore, or is that something that might still happen?
No, no, it's something that does still happen to a much smaller degree than it did historically. But the problem is that there's a number of the vast majority of breeding programs, in particular, with mammals. Um, there isn't an adequate number of founder animals, of original
Hmm.
animals come from the wild. So you're dealing with a very narrow genetic base for your program. And to use one example, Mishmitakin, big sort of goat-like ungulate. Um, all of the animals in captivity in primarily Europe, and there's a few in North America, all stem from two males and one female. And the population is I think over 150 now in Europe. So you're dealing with a very inbred population. Polar bears, different situation. We have about 60 founders. The population is genetically very sound. Then you got elephants, where African elephants in particular, there's lots of founders, but most of them have not reproduced.
Right.
And so but because they live a long time, they're still in the population, but there's no chance they're going to contribute. So you end up with a different genetic problem there. Um, Animals can come in from the wild, but again, the zoo community seems in some cases more concerned with PR and not being able to explain why bringing a very, very limited number of individuals from the wild that would benefit a captive program would be a good thing. And they just don't seem able to, or they don't seem to want to try and get that message across,
Hmm.
in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you say Mishby Tarkins as that example then because of kind of the gene pool. Um, what ethical considerations would be taken into consideration if they were going to translocate some wild Mishmi Tarkin into a zoological setting?
Well, I mean, the primary ethical questions concern, all right, how are the animals captured? If you look at historically, how did great apes, chimpanzees, orangs, gorillas, how did they come into zoos? And primarily, their parents or entire groups were shot, and then the babies were lifted off their dead or dying mothers. And that is how the zoo community got most of their great apes. Obviously, today, totally unacceptable. I mean, it was unacceptable
Hmm.
then. It's certainly unacceptable now. So the method of capture, are you endangering in any way or threatening the wild population from which you are taking animals from? If it's done, carefully and very selectively, then obviously the answer would be no. How are the animals being acclimated before leaving the range country? And how are they being transported? I mean, they're all very easy issues to deal with in a modern context, but they're all very important and have to be taken into account. And then there is the situation of, okay, we need to look at the bigger picture, and whatever stress that these new founder animals would go through in the long run, they will benefit the captive population, which increasingly you're dealing with a larger and larger percentage with a number of different species, of where the bulk of their population may exist in captivity and not in the wild. So I think ethically, I think we're ethically bound to actually bring stuff in from the wild to augment existing programs. But I also think we have a responsibility to bring species in from the wild that don't have a long and in-depth captive history. They may not be threatened, but we actually don't know very much about them. And so, for a lot of like basic biological parameters, gestation period, for example, that's something you can learn in captivity relatively easy. Very hard to find out what it is in the wild. But I think it's better to actually work out how to keep these animals when their population is plentiful, rather than what usually happens in conservation is let's wait till 2 seconds before the midnight that is extinction, and then we'll go and try and capture animals that we don't really know very much about. And the vaquita porpoise in the Gulf of California in North America, perfect example. The species is literally on the brink of extinction. And so they finally decide, right, let's go and capture some. We'll bring them into captivity. Porpoise are very difficult. They're not like dolphins at all. They're very prone to stress. And so they went to capture a few. I think one died, one was freaking out. They let it go, and they've almost walked away from it.
Mm.
So instead of doing something like that, when you could, for want of a better term, you could actually afford the losses,
Hmm.
they wait until every single animal death, for whatever reason, is actually another nail in the coffin for that species.
So in essence, it's a preventative for what could happen in terms of species going extinct. But you mentioned like the kind of PR aspect of zoos not wanting to necessarily do that or talk about it. So how should a zoo go down that route? How, or as a community, obviously, how are we equipped to deal with that?
By speaking to the non-zoo world, the general public, as adults. And in my experience, and I've dealt with a number of different, talked about a number of very difficult topics, sensitive topics, from the zoo industry, euthanasia, for example. And in my experience, when I have been dealing with the public on this, and I have been, one, completely honest with them, two, explain to them that, right, the explanation or what I'm about to talk to you about is not a soundbite. This is a 15, 20-minute explanation. So just bear with me on this. And without exception, I've never had a problem where an individual in that particular audience went, "Oh, this is absolutely dreadful. I'm going straight to the Daily Mail about this."
Hmm.
It's never happened, not to me. And I think it's because I treat the general public as adults and not as children to be protected from difficult stories, difficult information.
We've mentioned kind of one of the many ways of zoos contributing to the survival of species in the wild in the form of breeding programs. Um, for example, where there aren't reintroduction cases, how are zoos using these species when there aren't necessarily reintroduction plans in the near future?
I mean, this is an often made criticism of zoos by, say, the Born Free Foundation, for example. Well, the number of reintroductions are very, very small. Well, usually that's because, the wild population is still in danger, and the reasons for the diminishing wild population have not been removed, or there just isn't the space, the safe places to put animals back to. So we have a responsibility to set up insurance populations so that when a situation arises where we can actually put a species back, where it is appropriate to return it back to its historical range, or maybe an area where it never occurred historically, but where it would be safe and the habitat type is appropriate and it's not going to cause a problem for the animals that are already there. So this insurance population, there is the educational and ambassadorial role that zoo animals can play in teaching people about nature, about conservation. Does everybody that goes to the zoo, do they come away being better informed? No, they don't. Most people do go to the zoo because it's 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 a good day out, or this is something we have to do as a family. We have to take the kids to the zoo. And if it's in the UK, well, that's something you do at Easter. That's when the traditional UK zoo visiting period starts.
Hmm.
But you'll get through to a few. And having spoken with the likes of David Bellamy um, um, uh, and Attenborough, um, uh, they they're they were triggered to be interested in animals by going to what were at the time when they were kids, basically still Victorian style menageries,
Hmm.
but huge animal collections like at London Zoo in the 1930s, for example, with a phenomenal, I think it was the biggest animal collection in the world at the time. And it was just a source of fascination. And they became great defenders of zoos. People see like David Attenborough as being an advocate for the wild. He's also a very strong advocate for good zoos. So he himself says, there's no substitute. All of his programs, as excellent as they are, he himself says it's no substitute for seeing the animal in the flesh.
Hmm.
Seeing an elephant on your TV as opposed to going to Chester Zoo or Howlett's and seeing an elephant in a group, there is no substitute for that at all. Watching a football match on your TV or actually being at the game, that's the difference.
Yeah, yeah, very eloquently and kind of a nice metaphor with the football reference. And so, in terms of
Not that I know anything about football, just let's be clear on that, okay?
it exists. That's about it. Yeah, fair. So continuing that whole kind of talking to visitors like adults, then to what extent should we be pushing that, there's not necessarily a time frame on when we could start seeing a lot more reintroductions into the wild?
Okay. For a number of your listeners, they'll be aware of some of the things that Damien Aspinall, the owner of Howlett's and Port Zoos in the UK, and he pushes for reintroduction. And there have been criticisms from within the zoo community that some of the releases he was doing were not appropriate. And I actually I actually take a very different view. I actually think it's actually a very worthwhile thing to do as many reintroductions as possible, even with species that might be relatively common or still doing okay in the wild, purely to learn how to do it. Um, Almost every reintroduction of, particularly when you're looking at things like carnivores and primates, is there have been species-specific problems. And a bit like what I was saying about certain species like the vaquita, instead of waiting until stuff's really rare, then you start doing the breeding, in this case, doing the reintroduction. Let's do it, okay, at some point we may have to reintroduce polar bears. Well, let's look at reintroducing American black bears just as a kickoff point. There's lots to be learned potentially from the bear rescue community of which there is international in scope.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain countries where they do releases. We can learn from those, but I think we need to be experimenting. Will we have losses? Yes. But even in the best organized reintroduction projects, you're going to get a percentage of mortality. And that just goes with the territory. But even in the wild, your level of mortality will maybe not even be as bad as, or at worst match what might be the natural die-off rate for different age classes. But yeah, I think we should be doing more to find out more.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do we need to you know reintroduce it's actually these days I was going to try to think of a primate, but then every primate that went through my head was in some level of threat, and it was like, yes, that would be a good idea to look at reintroduction of pileated gibbons, or rescued orangutans back to some semblance of the wild. um but I think actually, just to go off on a slight tangent, I think this is, again, is a mistaken belief that there's still a wild out there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you look at many of the parks in East and Southern Africa, um, many of them are now fenced. They are, for all intents and purposes, mega zoos. Are the animals getting fed by human caretakers? No, they're not, but they are being monitored. And there is swapping of individuals for genetic reasons in some populations. And in South Africa, they pretty much got this down to a fine art. We've saw it a bit in North America. So this idea that we're going to be returning animals to pristine nature. No, we're not. What we are going to be doing is returning animals to our best efforts to create or maintain or protect what's left of the wild. So the animals have, to a reasonable degree, a wild lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
They will be managed to one degree or another. And what I've seen over my career is how often now techniques developed to manage zoo animals are being transferred to manage animals in what passes for the wild. I hope I answered your question there.
No, absolutely. And yeah, it's obviously not a black and white thing. So, like you say, it could have been easily a 20, 30 minute discussion in its own right. But to lay the foundations for that conversation is great. So thank you. So for the animals that are directly in our care, how are zoos ensuring that they are providing the highest levels of welfare and continue to push those standards, and just how's everything regulated?
Well, I mean, it's certainly in the UK, we have some of the best zoo legislation in the world. And, unusually for an industry, it was actually the reputable zoo community that pushed for the Zoo Licensing Act. Don't be under any illusion that this was something that was pushed by the anti-zoo community. It wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this extraordinary thing where an industry actually opted for more control of them, for them to be controlled more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you have that. How that has evolved is now we have there's a number of different welfare assessment tools that are available, different approaches, different projects that have looked at how best to assess the welfare of a particular individual animal or a group of animals. What I think is unfortunate is, I'm probably going to say something along these lines on a number of occasions during this discussion, but the newer generation many of them have a difficulty in interpreting a situation themselves without some kind of form or table or chart. And as an example, everybody now wants a body conformation chart for this species or that species, with a range of maybe 8 pictures of an animal in profile from emaciated to obese, so that they can actually see if their animals are in good condition.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever happened to using your eyes? And I've spoken to a very reputable zoo nutritionist about this. When since do we need a chart? How can we not just go, geez, so and so is looking a bit on the thin side, or getting a bit chunky. I think we need to cut them back a little bit. Whatever happened to that? And this nutritionist laughed. He said, "Yeah, you're absolutely right. We used to be able to do this with varied diets on, if not a daily basis, a weekly or a monthly basis, or at least seasonally, to keep animals in good physical condition." And that seems to have gone out the window. And now I don't know whether it's they don't trust themselves, or there needs to be a mechanism, a template for them to use. And I just find it a little bit peculiar. There's a friend of mine who he's an art expert, and there's a particular artist that he is internationally renowned as being an expert on, and he could see a painting by one of these artists that he's very familiar with, a painting that he's never seen before, and he would know right away, oh, that was painted by so and so.
Mm-hmm.
Just be able to tell. I remember asking, I said, well, how do you do that? How do you, and it was actually quite hard for him to articulate. Um, I think it was just from experience of looking at a lot of this artist's art, he was able to pick up on subtle signals that indicated that, yeah, this is a work by this chap. A good zoo person can go to a zoo that they've never been to before and look at an animal enclosure and within a couple of 3 seconds go, that's a really good animal enclosure. That's really good for that species. And like my friend, the artist, it can be, okay, right, well, what do you mean? And it's like, okay, and I'd really have to think about it to actually break it down into, right, what is it that what's making what indicates to me that this is a good animal enclosure. So a lot of it is, you know, I've seen the full gamut of enclosures for a wide range of species, from the dreadful to the fantastic and everything in between. And then working with over my career a wide range of species, and so having a fairly intimate knowledge of their behavior, their needs, their social structure, etc. And so looking at an enclosure, I can, make a rapid assessment, if you like. But now, by rights, I would need to fill out a form to say, okay, yeah, okay, this ticks this box, this box, this box, and this box. And maybe that is a better way to do it. I don't know. But it's that you can develop a level of intuitiveness as to what accounts for a good place for animals to live or animals that are behaving normally. Um, but a lot of it is actually, a lot of people now are not particularly well read.
Hmm.
So, have they, whatever information is available on the species they're looking after, be it in the wild or in other zoos, are they familiar with all that literature? Many of them are not. And so all of their experience is based on that narrow prism of what they have worked with, what they've seen themselves, and they're not able to tap into that much wider published experience um, of the rest of the zoo community. That my go-to for any species that I was working with, just to find out more about, was the International Zoo Yearbook, which was published by the Zoological Society of London. And they started publishing it in 1960 and they stopped 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's an incredible shame because it was the Bible.
Hmm.
If you worked in zoos and you're right, I've got Asiatic black bear coming into my collection. I've never worked with them, right? You'd go to the yearbook, okay, right, are there any papers published on managing Asiatic black bears? What's good behavior? What's a good enclosure for them? That's what you'd be your first stop shop. And it's unfortunate that doesn't exist anymore. There's no new ones being produced, as it were. So welfare is obviously the most important aspect. Conservation, without good welfare, we can't have good conservation. I think that is how I would view it. If the animals, if we're not conserving, it's not just conserving genes, we
Hmm.
have to conserve behavior. And if there's not good welfare, then you're going to get abnormal behavior and you won't be conserving the animals won't be brought up in the right environment to make them potentially successful release candidates if we're going down the reintroduction road. So, yeah, welfare is supremely important, probably more so than it's ever been. But and there is a range of tools for measuring it. Um, for me, I still rely upon my eyes and my experience and the experience of my career's worth of colleagues that I've either worked with or spent a few hours down the pub with, swapping stories. You can learn a lot over a pint of beer. You really can.
um, to what extent are the events happening in the wild dictating what is going on in zoos?
Well, I mean, for zoos to be significant players in the protection of the wild it's not a new thing, but it's relatively new as far as more institutions getting on board with it. Um, I mean, a lot of the conservation arguments are for zoos are credited to Gerald Durrell, for example. You've got a generation now who actually don't know who he is. Um, but it was a minority of collections. It was Jersey, it was the Bronx Zoo in New York. There was some early stuff from London as far as certain species were concerned, but it's really very, very recently that zoos have become the major or the zoo community has become the major contributor to conservation in the field, and I think they now rank number three as far as the impact of protecting wild places and conservation of species in the wild. Um, but a lot of that still down to a minority of zoos. Most places they talk a good conservation story, and it might amount to, they'll give £1,000 a year to a particular project for black rhinos or tigers or whatever it might be. And they think they're doing a good thing. They are doing a good thing, but are they realizing their conservation potential? No. Most places aren't even coming close. And I think it drifts back into not just, what you're supporting in the field. I mean, in North America, if you take San Diego, the National Zoo in Washington, the new still call it the New York Zoological Society, the Wildlife Conservation Society, one or two other, Chicago, Brookfield, Chicago. You take those half a dozen places out of the equation, and they're probably, and this is just purely off the top of my head, they're probably responsible for about 60 to 70% of the conservation done in American zoos, field conservation done in American zoos. And everybody else is doing, if anything at all, they're doing a tiny wee bit. And I think it's less true over here. At the UK zoos, I think punch way above their weight, particularly when you consider that UK zoos would almost without exception get no funding from government at all.
Mm-hmm.
For capital development or anything like that, and we still contribute to conservation. I think that, but then again, part of that is down to legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And that should hopefully become a stronger impetus to contribute to conservation with the new Secretary of State's or the revised set of the Secretary of State standards for managing zoos. You go to a lot of zoos in Asia, and where the modern zoo world is just kind of arriving. Their contribution in general to conservation is nil. In fact, they may still be a bit of a drain on the wild just because of the animals still coming into the collection. So some places are doing an amazing job, from managing breeding programs to reintroduction to supporting conservation in the field, both from a staff point of view, from a financial point of view, or providing equipment. But most places are it's almost it's almost lip service as opposed to anything really tangible.
So then how can we inspire those that are already doing lots, obviously already probably want to do more and will continue to do more, not maybe just because of legislation like in the UK. It's obviously twofold in the UK. We want to do it, but legally we're obliged to. But yeah, how can we inspire everyone to continue the good work that they're doing and be like, yeah, okay, £1,000 is great. We do need to be doing more.
Right. Okay. Part of it is there's people from the corporate world who have drifted into the zoo community, and they usually drift back out again fairly rapidly after they've done a bit of damage. Um, some have been positive forces for good, but the majority, in my view, have not been. They don't understand animals. They don't understand the people that work with them. The language that they speak is the language of the director of finance or human resources. It's not the language of the zoological director. So if you're looking to say during a period like COVID, for example, right, we need to affect savings. What's the first thing that's going to be jettisoned? And that's conservation because, that's not contributing to the business. So having individuals that don't get conservation, they can barely spell it, never mind understand it. And so their priorities will be very different. So if you look at a number of zoos, it's like I made a comment. There was an image of a small mammal house in a zoo in Japan on one of the Facebook groups, and I put comment on it. Well, geez, that's almost a rarer entity than any of the animals that they might be housing, because you almost don't see small mammal houses anymore. And the vast majority of highly threatened species are small mammals.
Mm.
We think of tigers, rhinos, elephants, giant panda, but actually there's a whole bunch of stuff that is maybe no bigger than that is actually highly threatened. And your corporate types, they have no idea what a tarsier is or a Hispaniolan solenodon, but they have a bit of an idea. Oh yeah, people like to see lions and tigers and bears and rhinos. And so your zoos have become very mammal focused.
Mhm.
And bird flu hasn't helped. I've seen collections in the UK jettisoning significant proportions of their bird collection, all because of bird flu. Oh, right, let's avoid being closed. Let's reduce that risk. And so you get, there's some places that have had fantastic bird collections that are mere shadows of their former self. So you get this thing where it's like, okay, what we want is big mammals. So you get large mammals, no small ones, very few birds, and maybe a reptile house with, some big examples, some exotic examples, some venomous stuff, and it's all about show. And so the range of species that we are able to help from a captive breeding point of view becomes even more limited. I think I went off at a bit of a tangent there.
No, but it's certainly, there is that species bias. So I suppose then, yeah, how do we overcome species bias?
Oh, I think there has to be an understanding that I actually I hadn't published it, but I actually started to go through. Okay, what there was as I said, there's argument. Well, this is what people can identify. This is what they want to see, and I actually started to run through the list of right what can the general public identify. And when it came to mammals, it was about 20 different species. That was it, or species groups.
Mm.
An antelope is an antelope is an antelope. Whether it's a giant eland or a Kafue lechwe, it's all pretty much the same. Yeah, the brown ones with big, branched horns, well, they're deer. That's it. There's just deer. That's one species. Bears, a little bit more variety. You got white ones, black ones, and brown ones. The stripy one cats are tigers, the orange ones are lions. The spotted ones could be anything from cheetah to jaguar to leopard, but they're just a spotted cat. So what the public can identify is actually very, very limited. In my experience, what the visitors want to see are active animals. And going back to your welfare question of if you've got good environments and appropriate social groups for your animals and a good enrichment program and a good feeding regime that is interesting and demanding for the animal, you can create a lot of activity. So at the Highland Wildlife Park, we did it in such a way that, okay, we have one big charismatic species here. So we've got the tigers, and then you've got brown ungulate, brown ungulate, brown ungulate, polar bears, brown ungulate, brown ungulate, brown monkey, wolves. And but because of the groups where we're keeping stuff in, is even when people were going by the brown ungulate, because there was a big group or a really impressive male or babies on the ground, it was interesting for them. They didn't know what they were looking at, but they were fascinated because they were doing, people want to see animals doing animal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They also don't care whether, the enrichment they're interacting with is bright blue plastic or some natural looking fiberglass model of an animal carcass. And if they hit the right rib, a ball of mincemeat drops down or something. They just want to see animals doing animal stuff. So you can have a varied collection that the vast majority of which the public can't recognize. London Zoo and San Diego and Bronx Zoo and Zoo Berlin were all incredibly popular in their day. Some of them still are very popular, millions of visitors. Because people, I think there's an element of people knowing that when they went to San Diego or the Bronx or London or Berlin, they were going to see one of the most amazing animal collections in the world. Would they be able to identify even more than 5% of what they saw? No. But they knew that they were getting value for money, because there was, London, they all had about, all those zoos, they all had about 200 species of mammals.
Mm.
I doubt there's many zoos left on the planet that have, more than 60, 70 species of mammal on exhibit anymore. I mean, that sounds very basic, but I think, last summer, I hadn't visited Chester Zoo in ages. And so I was there for a meeting. I went there a couple of days early or day early so I could play zoo tourist and have a proper
Yeah.
look around Chester Zoo. And everywhere you went, there was animals. There was, you go around, something, big and interesting and charismatic. You go around the corner, and there's a, squirrel cage or a bird aviary or what. There was stuff everywhere. It was a fabulous day out. They do really well. What is it? They're, I think, maybe over 2 million visitors a year now, or approaching 2 million. Um, do all of their visitors know what they're looking at? Of course they don't. Do they think they're getting value for money? Pretty sure they do.
Yeah, it's definitely a sense of discovery.
Well, this is it. And something obscure. If porcupines, most of the time they're half asleep. But if they're tanking about the enclosure or attacking a fresh log that's in the enclosure, people will stop and watch them.
Yeah.
So as Heidegger put it, the exhibition value of animals varies. People want to see lions, but most of the time lions are asleep in a pile in the enclosure. But every now and again they get active, or the male gets up, starts roaring, or cubs are playing, or whatever, and their exhibition value goes up. That's true for absolutely any species.
We've talked about zoos as they were, we've talked about zoos as they are. What do you think the zoos of the future will look like?
I was When I was working at Rome Zoo, um, I was on duty on Christmas Day, and I don't have kids, so usually happy for the rest of the curatorial team, right? You guys can take off. I'll come in and make sure everything is all right and secure, and the keepers are sorted out. And there was an American woman who did quite a lot to improve the situation in Indian zoos, a woman called Sally Walker. And there was a group online called Zoo Biology, and people could pose questions to it. And there was a wealth of experience that tapped into it, and directors, curators, keepers, vets. So you asked a question, not to specifically mention a particular Facebook group, but just because you pose an answer to a question on one of these groups doesn't mean you actually know what the hell you're talking about. But with this one, there was huge expertise. And so people were getting really good answers. And there was some really interesting debates that would go on in the group as well. And anyway, on this, I was going through, you get about a dozen emails a day with different questions. And I enjoyed contributing. That's how I spent most of my lunch breaks. And Sally produced this series of questions, and one of them was zoos of the future. What do you think it's going to be? And so I gave this a bit of thought, and I used sort of elephants as the example. And we all know that we get the anti-zoo group saying, instead of giving, say, as used to be the case, a donation from the local government in London to get school kids to go to London Zoo. Let's use that money to send school kids to parks in East Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anybody that knows anything about tourism to these places, they're probably at, if not beyond capacity. The damage that is potentially being done by the number of tour vehicles out there, the resources that are being used in some of these areas, which are now increasingly drought-ridden, the tourism industry could actually end up doing more harm than good. And so with something like elephants, instead of going to East Africa or Southern Africa to see elephants, you might have two or three locations in, say, Southern Europe,
Mm-hmm.
where there were big herds of African elephants. Now, whether it was a zoo that did elephants, or maybe just an elephant facility. So you actually went to see elephants in southern Spain, for
Mm-hmm.
example, but on a huge scale. So I think that's one thing that can change. And maybe if we actually look at the elephant sanctuaries in the US in particular, I think that actually might give us an idea of how we should be managing our elephants, and on a very different scale than is currently the case. I think I would hope that we'll start to maybe see I thought about whether we should start to see a divide of, more cold weather adapted animals in, say, Northern Europe, and warmer, more tropical species in Southern Europe. But given how climate change is going on, there is no guarantee of
Mm-hmm.
cold weather anywhere in Europe. I mean, when I was working at the park, when we had the first polar bear cub, it got up to 31 degrees one of the days. Unheard of temperatures for the Central Highlands of Scotland. And one is now seeing this, even above the Arctic Circle, you're getting those sorts of temperatures. So I think my idea of tropical species in warmer zones might be going out the window. But I think it's the large scale thing. I think it's the when safari parks started, a lot of anti-zoo people, okay, right, here's the solution. These huge areas compared to urban zoos at the time. And this is the way forward. Originally, safari parks were not terribly well managed, not from an animal welfare point of view, not especially. That has changed, and they're able to do stuff on a scale that most urban zoos cannot. Um, so, there's no elephants in urban zoos in the UK anymore, and I think that's right and proper. Um, should London Zoo be smaller animals and Whipsnade Zoo be bigger animals as they're the same zoological society? I think there just needs to be a bit more selection as to what your site can actually cope with, what is appropriate, what can you manage. Forest species are less likely to live in herds, so creating environments that are appropriate in a place like London Zoo is easier for a forest animal like an okapi than maybe it is for a giraffe. So I think it's back to your welfare argument. I think that will start to dictate where you'll see certain species. I think that might be the biggest change. I think zoos will, as far as their perception, I think zoos there will always be a contentious issue about them that people will have a problem with animals in captivity, but rightly or wrongly. I think that will always be with us. I think the zoo visiting community in the UK is probably more critical than in many other countries. And I think that's a good thing. I think people should be critical of it. I think more importantly, people that work in the zoo community should be critical. You should review what you do on a regular basis. Are you doing it as well as you can? Or is it up to the minute? Are you doing, are you managing that species as well as they should be? This is something that you constantly have to ask. And if you stop asking, then I'm afraid you're not doing the job very well. It's really easy to look after animals in zoos badly. It's actually quite hard to do it well.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And it's something that we certainly discussed in our pre-interview prior to this is that not even just the zoo industry, but pertaining to the zoo industry, without challenging it, progression doesn't happen.
Hmm.
And it's not that we're here to point fingers, like you said right at the very beginning, we're here to increase standards across the board. And I'm certainly not going to be writing husbandry guidelines or anything like that anytime soon. But yeah, it's almost putting a positive spin on having that criticism from public, bringing it inside, and be like, well, actually, are they right?
Unfortunately, the zoo community in general doesn't take criticism very well at all. And when it comes from pressure groups from outside, I mean, from the UK zoo community, the policy of the precursor to BIASA, the British and Irish Zoo Association, the Zoo Federation, was when Zoo Check, which became the Born Free Foundation, when they said anything in public or, got column inches in a Sunday newspaper, oh, don't react to them, they'll go away. Well, that policy worked out real well. And so, I was always for, right, let's take these guys head on. Let's agree with them when they're right. Let's try and anticipate. Let's be proactive and not reactive. And when they're wrong, let's go at them and tell, okay, right, actually, you've got the wrong end of the stick here. You're misinterpreting the situation for the public and your supporters. You're not doing you or the zoo community a service, a good service at all. So I'm all for being critical, but unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues in the zoo community don't take criticism particularly well at all, which is, I think, a general failing.
What are some of the biggest conservation success stories that are directly influenced by the work of zoos?
Well, I mean, going right back, I mean, zoos weren't solely responsible, but I think, yeah, the Bronx Zoo led the way back in the early part of the 20th century when they were breeding American bison and then sending them back to, I think it was Oklahoma and Kansas to create new wild herds because the species was literally on the brink. Um, I think the Yellowstone population was the only truly wild one in the contiguous US. The European bison is its survival is solely down to zoos. If it wasn't for zoos, and that effort started in 1923. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary at Zoo Berlin last summer of the zoo community's involvement in bison conservation. Without zoos, there would be no European bison. The golden lion tamarin, small Brazilian primate, never went extinct in the wild, but the numbers were dropping quite dramatically in the Atlantic forests in Brazil. And they were augmented by animals from captivity. It's arguable that the golden lion tamarin, a very charismatic little primate, would have disappeared without that assistance from the wild population. California condor, there had the conservation, the anti-zoo community got their way, the California condor would be extinct today because they fought tooth and nail in through the courts to stop the last handful of condors. I think it was 11 birds, if I remember correctly, being brought into captivity when they went to San Diego at the Wild Animal Park to set up the first real breeding colony. And they fought. It was like, it's like what they used to say when I was growing up in America, just when it came to the Soviet Union, better dead than red. Well, as far as they were concerned, it was better dead than bred. Let's not bring them into captivity. Let's let them become sort of extinct with some semblance of honor. I'm not sure there's anything terribly honorable about extinction. Um, You've got, I mean, things like, on the other end of the scale, partulus snails, now a lot of that was down to, I think it was Nottingham University, but the zoo community, and in a large part led by Paul Pierce Kelly and his team at London Zoo, to really bring partulus snail to the fore and start doing, real captive conservation with them and then reintroduction. So there is there's a number of species, the Socorro dove. I don't think, the situation, is not appropriate for releasing them, but it's, building the numbers up in captivity. We have animals that, locally incredibly rare and, like the capercaillie in Scotland, again on the verge of extinction. I mean, that'll be potentially going extinct twice, which is a little bit embarrassing. So, is there a captive role to play there? I think we need to look at those positive examples and say, okay, right, we made a difference with these species. We should be able to make a difference with others. We also have a situation where, with the Amur tiger, for example, we now know that there are genetic haplotypes for the Amur tiger that only now exist in captivity. They don't exist in the wild populations anymore. So what you have is you might still have a wild population, but they may be genetically depauperate. And so, they might not be going extinct. They're pretty well protected, but are they sustainable from a genetic point of view? Will there start to be problems? Do we need to start looking at augmenting the wild population, which is relatively stable? Do we need to start augmenting them with genes or individuals from the captive population to make them healthier. So I think that will be increasingly more important as wild populations become smaller, more fragmented. Then we'll look at their counterparts in the zoo community and we'll say, okay, right, we can boost this population or that population or whatever with animals or genes, depending on technology. And from the zoo community can avoid an extinction scenario.
Zoos are very proud about shouting about things that are successful, so I think it's incredibly important to keep voicing those things. But yeah, like you say, there are those success models that we need to keep relevant so we can start applying them to other
Which I think
species.
is very important and pertinent in that, there are also some success stories that you speak to younger zookeepers and they have no idea what you're talking about. Arabian oryx, saved by captivity, no question. Per David deer, saved by captivity, no question. But they don't know those examples. And I remember as, if I was defending zoos as a young zookeeper, I used to get a little bit embarrassed because you ended up parroting, it was the same examples, European bison, Arabian oryx, Bear David deer. I was like, okay, right, we need, for me to make a better argument, I need more examples. Well, we have more examples now, but for a lot of the animals that we manage, there is no, their wild population is almost definitely going to disappear before we're in a position to actually do anything about it for using using the captive individuals. The world is going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. That's for damn sure.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, it is. And obviously, no one. I think a lot of people aren't under this impression that it is all hunky dory all the time. I think, like you say, everyone is quite aware that it is a very draining industry, but with the efforts of people, it will get better
But
at some point.
I think it's arguable whether the zoo community was ever a drain on the wild. I'm not sure it ever was. I mean, even with something like great apes, where, groups were getting slaughtered to get hold of the babies to sell to zoos. In the grand scheme of things, I think it was an infinitesimally small, there was all kinds of furor about those wild elephants that the whole groups that were moved out of Namibia and into a couple of zoos in the Mideast. And my understanding, these animals were destined to be culled. So they were going to catch a bullet. And they moved the whole groups. It wasn't just the old technique, right? We're going to cull the adults and then the babies that are all traumatized, they go to zoos. It was doing what San Diego did with the elephants at Swaziland. It was an amazing project, but moving an entire group, including wild adult females, moving the whole herd in a winter. So this is what they did, but they got ostracized for it. I mean, Alain Zoo got thrown out of IAZA, and they broke no laws. They did nothing illegal. But we're back to this thing, bringing elephants in from the wild. And the African elephant program it's not doing very well, not really. There's some places that are getting good results, but is it sustainable? Not yet. And so these animals were actually quite valuable for the program. But again, it was almost like the zoo community cutting its nose off to spite its face. Instead of defending what was legitimate, as they were ostracized. And I don't understand.
We've kind of had a nice insight into general zoos, just want to switch and talk about your career for a bit before we finish up. So, yeah, you've been associated with zoos for over 40 years, and you started off in Edinburgh. You've jet setted around the world. So, yeah, how did you get into this industry?
Um, I mean, I'm lucky in that that's all I wanted to really do. Um, so it is like the kid that, wanted to be an astronaut or a fireman or whatever. Well, I wanted to work in zoos. So, going to Edinburgh Zoo as a small kid, at Easter. And for me, the fascination was what's behind that door that says keepers only or staff only. I wanted to know what went on behind the scenes. How do they manage these animals? And getting when I was a kid, getting hold of books on zoos that were virtually non-existent. I mean, it really wasn't until the mid 60s that, anything accessible started to be published. Fisher's Zoos of the World and Kirchhoffer's The World of Zoos were kind of my first two proper zoo books, that actually talked about and explained how zoos operate. And so for me, it was all I ever wanted to do, and I didn't understand many of my school friends who had no idea what they wanted to do, had no particular interest, had no focus.
Yeah, yeah. So then, fast forward, you've finished school. How did you go about getting your first role?
Well, I did actually my secondary school education in America, and I thought, okay, right, should I go to university? Should I go straight into zoos? And I actually wrote to Bill Conway, the director, the very influential director of the Bronx Zoo, or president of the New York Zoological Society, or WCS. And he passed it on to the guy who was the former curator of mammals, who was basically the scientific assistant to the director, a guy called Joe Davis. And I was, what, 16, 15, 16 or something. And Joe got in touch. He said, look, tell you what, why don't you come in? We'll have a chat. And which I thought was, very, generous of him. And so I went into the Bronx Zoo from Long Island, and spent the day with him, a lot of time in his office. And then he took me out to the zoo and we went behind the scenes, in the Lionhouse basement full of larger Malayan mouse deer. And, it was just that it was my first Haka insight into how a zoo like the Bronx operates. And we had the debate. It was like, okay, should I go to university? Should I start in the zoo game? And at the time, there was no university courses about zoos. And anybody thinks that a zoology degree is somehow going to help you work in zoos, you're going to be very sadly mistaken and find out that you've just wasted 3 or 4 years and a lot of your parents' money, to get a qualification that is worthless. Nowadays, there are degree courses that focus specifically on, zoo management, conservation management, of animals in a captive situation. So you can get a qualification. But I just went into zoos, and then it was a matter of, when I finished high school, like, got half promised a job at London Zoo that never materialized when I moved back to the UK. And I ended up, moving back north where some of my family were in Edinburgh, and went into the zoo, chatting one of the keepers, any vacancies. Oh yeah, actually there's one at the minute. Got an interview, got the job, and it was downhill from there.
Has there been one individual animal or species in your career that you gained a particular attachment or relationship to?
there's been a number of them at different times in my career. I mean, I suppose when I was at Howlett's, it was clouded leopards. People talk about cheetahs being the most difficult cat to breed. No, yeah, clouded leopards, without a doubt. And so, I mean, when I left Howlett's, I think we had 21, 22 cloudies at the park. So I got a lot of experience with them, and I would get tapped into for advice on how to manage clouded leopards. Um, I mean, cats, that's kind of what I started with in general, and what I suppose I gained a bit of a reputation for. More recently, because of what I did, with the species at Highland Wildlife Park, it now seems to be polar bears is the species that a lot of people connect me with or come to me for advice about. So I suppose it's just varied, through different parts of my career, different animals. But there's never been one common species right the way throughout.
Sure. And so now, as a consultant, what does a typical day look like for you?
Typical day. Well, I mean, from today, for example, I'm working from home, so catching up on emails and invoices and reports, and the mundane side of the zoo consultancy bit. Occasionally getting asked interesting questions. I usually have a bit of a contest. It's like, like, who's supplied me with the most interesting email today? And it'll be some obscure question, whatever it might be. But then I'm going to be traveling for sometimes 2.5 weeks on the trot, maybe 3 different jobs back to back, from Europe to India to China. So the idea of a typical day, not sure I could pin that one down. There's no an atypical day is pretty much most days. That's the cool part of this industry. And that is, you're working in a zoo, and what you can hope for, and it can, because it is a vocation, and because people can be so passionate about it, is what you hope for is that the bad parts of the job are at least balanced out by the good results. The animal death as opposed to the animal birth. And that's what you hope is going to happen, is that the majority of what you deal with is going to be positive, or interesting, or new, or you'll see something you've never seen before, a behavior or whatever it might be, just something, that you didn't expect. And if you're not observant, you're going to miss a lot of that.
Mm.
And I'm afraid, and God, I'm back to stabbing and having a go at the younger generation. But walking through the car park at the zoo, looking at your phone instead of looking at the animals around you, you're not doing your job. Just because you're on the way to the cafe to get a sandwich and a bowl of soup, you should still be looking at stuff, or at the very least, looking out for visitors who, look like they just got dropped from Mars and don't know which way to go.
Would you say that there's one lesson that animals has taught you?
Well, about what I just said is observation.
Hmm.
You need to have good observation skills. And I remember I was walking down Princess Street in Edinburgh with my aunt, very busy shopping street, and I could see someone with a disability coming towards us, and I just moved to the side to let them come past. And my aunt was like, "Oh, how did you see that?" And I said, "Well, it's what I'm constantly looking out for. Obviously from a zoo situation, that as well, what people are up to, good, bad, and indifferent. What your animals are up to. So it's observation. It's being really aware of what's going on in your environment, and maybe expecting the unexpected.
What are some of your proudest achievements to date?
Well, I mean, there's been a few, I suppose. I mean, there was four of us from Scotland that got the UK keepers course started. Again, another fact that's disappeared in the annals of time. We decide, the then Zoo Federation had been talking about it and talking about it, and nothing had happened. And so we decided, okay, right, we're going to make this happen. And we actually did it through ABWAC. And believe it or not, we actually had arguments with people within the Association of British Wild Animal Keepers about whether we needed a keeper training course or not. Now it's just accepted, what we started or what we initiated, is now evolved into the DIMSA, the diploma in management of zoo and aquarium animals, that's run by Sparsholt College. That offering is international because it was a correspondence course. People could do it anywhere. And I mean, when I went to Singapore, some of my senior colleagues there had done the animal management course because it's a correspondence course. Enabling the world's first breeding of striped possum, not the most dynamic animal in the world, but getting a world first breeding under your belt, that was always an aim. I find it strange that, I was researching images for a talk, and it was just, random Google image. Let's see what's out there. And this thing came up from a zoo in the States. Most important role of a zookeeper is training. I thought, well, I missed that memo. And I always thought, that in my day it was a world first breeding. That was what you really wanted, to breed your animals, not necessarily to get them walk into a box on command. To introducing a non-architect approach to zoo design, particularly with things like, the polar bear facility that I designed, had built at Highland Wildlife Park, and now has been copied in a number of different locations. My approach to zoo design is very different. With all due respect to a number of good zoo architects, it's a very small number. But I sometimes think that we should concentrate on developing a genetic test to be able to identify zoo architects at birth so we could kill them before they actually do any damage. But there are some good ones. Don't get me wrong, there are some good. But I think probably well, my most proudest achievement was being part of the team that kept London Zoo from closing. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that in the early 90s, London Zoo, what they announced closure.
Mm.
And there was a number of us in the zoo, mainly on the animal side, and we're talking like half a dozen people, and combined with a number of the fellows of the society, that basically went up against the great and the good and got a closure decision changed, and a number of people actually thrown off the board, out of their positions. Anybody, particularly in the zoo community, who has not watched Molly Dineen's four-part documentary, The Ark, one, it's incredibly interesting because of a very important and stressful time in the history of London Zoo. And just a picture of what was going on at that time. And how one of the most influential, if not the most influential zoo in the world, how it came that far away from closing.
What is, in your opinion, the biggest challenge facing conservation?
I think probably the scale of the problem. Um, are zoos the answer? No. Are zoos part of the answer? Yes. Are zoos, as you know, we talked about earlier, are they realizing their conservation potential? In most cases, no. In fact, in almost every case, no. There's some places that are doing an amazing amount of work. Could they do more? Yes. Could they do more without impacting their business? I would say yes. But most places aren't even coming close. I mean, my favorite bugbear is everywhere you go, there's meerkats, completely unthreatened. Is it appropriate? Oh, well, we need them because we do, keep it experiences and people can come in and feed the meerkats and whatnot. And then you go to places and some, I've seen zoos with like three groups of meerkats, you know. Um, are we getting caught up too much in that? I mean, I remember when zoos stopped the public feeding of animals. I think it was 67. London Zoo was the first. And how long that took. And now we've gone completely the other way. Oh, come on and, pay your £10, £20, £100, whatever it is, to feed the giraffes or the manatees or whatever it might be. So the the animal experience, as important as that is, we've gotten to the point where the people have to experience it. They can't just walk about and look at something. That for some reason they have to have the
Hmm.
experience as opposed to just looking and wondering and being fascinated by something that you see as opposed to something that you feel you've got to touch.
What is some of the best advice that you received from a mentor or a colleague in this industry?
It was a colleague and a very good friend who unfortunately is no longer with us, Graham Law, who basically, if anybody's responsible for advancing enrichment, particularly of carnivores, Graham is the guy. And his thing was publish, 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 publish. Douglas, you don't publish enough. And he was absolutely correct. There's more I should have done, and there's more that I need to do as far as getting, you know, the you know, whatever the value of the information that's locked in my head or the experiences that I've had is to actually get that down on paper or on a website or some accessible medium. I think that's probably the most important thing is publish. Don't the number of I mean it used to be a standing joke at London Zoo that that it was always the deputy head keeper would get told the trade secrets by the head keeper on his deathbed, and he would pass on the key bits of information. Now that you'll be taking the reins, here's the secrets to how to do this, that, and the next thing. And there was always in the zoo community, there's always an element of that. And I've met a number of people that have kept things to themselves because well, if I keep the information, then I won't be threatened.
Hmm.
When in actual fact, well, surely you should still be on a learning, if not a vertical learning curve, certainly it's still going at an upward angle. And so you're always going to be ahead of whoever's coming up behind you. You're still learning, or you should be. If you've stopped learning, then you're in the wrong bloody job. So yeah, so publish, pass on that information. That is probably amongst the most important, if not the most important message that I got, and it was from a colleague, Graham Law.
And lastly, then, before we just finish up on some more light-hearted notes, what gives you motivation of?
I suppose it's the fact that when I do eventually hop off this mortal coil, um, I will know that I gave it my best shot. And I'm lucky in as much as I'm not, though I can, and it might have come across in this interview, I can be quite cynical about aspects of the zoo industry. But it still fascinates me. Going to a zoo that I did a trip recently to Kazakhstan to do a bit of work, or give a bit of advice to Almaty Zoo. And again, I've known of the existence of the of this zoo for a long, 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 long time, never been. And so for me, just going to zoos I've never been to before is a blast. I mean, I am warped, and I remember I would myself and Simon Tong, who at the time was the general curator, he was my immediate boss at London, and him and I were asked to go to Amazon World on the Isle of Wight to do an inspection for Bayaza. Anyway, we're down there with the owner and a very nice time, beautiful day. We're sitting outside having lunch, and the owner was just quizzing us, like, what do you guys do? How did you get into the game? And there was a real difference between Simon and me. Simon would go to great efforts to see something in the wild. I would go to great efforts to go to a zoo I've never been to before. And if given the choice, right, Douglas, we're going to take you to the Masai Mara, or you're going to visit Shanghai Zoo. I'd opt for Shanghai Zoo, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think certainly no one's questioning your loyalty and your passion for your work. So it's nice to hear, that for someone that's spent a lifetime doing this, that there are still things that motivate you and inspire you to continue.
Oh no, it's I mean, and I enjoy interacting, though I'm sure I can be rather more sarcastic than I should, with the younger generation. I mean, the Keeper Fest, which they're running again at Jimmy's Farm in Wildlife Park this September. I was there for the participated in the first one, did a couple of talks and whatnot, and I enjoy speaking with the younger generation, maybe, for what it's worth, giving them a bit of advice, or, just getting their perspective on things, how stuff has changed. Um, with ABWAC, the Association of British Wild Animal Keepers, again, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to their 50th anniversary meeting that was held at London Zoo earlier this month. Again, an organization I was a member of, a year after it started. And I've, spoken at conferences they've had much more recently. And the organization has evolved way beyond what it was when I was first a member. So no, I enjoy the crack. I enjoy zoos. I very much enjoy chatting with people that work in zoos. It still gives me reason to get up in the morning.
See, for someone that's been around the world, you've been to a lot of zoos. Are there any dream species that you'd love to see in a zoo that you've maybe not seen yet, or to better yet work with?
Sawa, the Pseudorix, that species of horned ungulate that was discovered in Vietnam in the early 90s. Myself and Radislav, the ex-director of Wrocław Zoo in Poland, him and I went out, and we were the only ones to go out there when that first one was brought into captivity at the forestry department offices in Hanoi, and we were helping them. So we've got a long history with that species, and recently, or more recently, got involved with the Saola working group. So the idea of getting a captive program, if they still exist, and apparently there is a possibility that they may have been wiped out. Again, it's one of these ones where we've waited too bloody long to set up a captive program. So I think Saola would be at the top of my list, as far as species I'd like to work with.
Yeah, I can appreciate that for sure. And again, you've probably stepped foot on most of them already, but is there any one country or continent that you'd like to visit for the first time that you maybe haven't visited, or that you have visited and you'd love to spend more time in?
I mean, having lived on 3 different continents and multiple countries, I'm actually quite happy to be back in Scotland. Um, Visiting places, yep, terrific. Always up for that. Living somewhere different, no, I think I think I won't be emigrating from Scotland again.
No, very valid, and beautiful, beautiful wildlife, beautiful everything up there. So, yeah,
Very whiskey, actually.
very good whiskey. Yeah, if that's what's keeping you staying there, I'm not going to argue with that for sure. And when you're not working, how do you keep busy?
Um, well, the thing is, I mean, for my job is also my hobby. I mean, we're doing this interview. I'm sitting in my study, surrounded by hundreds of volumes of my own personal library. Um, as I've said, the zoos are still an all-encompassing interest for me. So, the my work and my free time, the activity, it kind of blends into one. So, yeah, no, the idea of having an interest in my free time that is not associated with zoos would be a bit alien, I suppose. Just that wouldn't be me. Taking my dog for a walk. Yeah.
What is one thing that you think our listeners should take away from today's episode?
Oh, good question. Right. I think if anybody, okay, you've been asking me about my half century going on for in the game, and I think that the most important thing for people to take away from, if they're going to do their job as well as they can, there has to be an understanding of the history of the business in which you work. I mean, it's the old saying, if you don't know where you've come from, how do you know where you're going? And I've seen wheels being reinvented on multiple occasions and not necessarily for the better. Um, the at the at the ABWAC 50th anniversary conference at London Zoo, there was some, history tours and whatnot. And I've been told that, there was people that work at London Zoo, that there was people that don't work at London Zoo had a better idea of the history of the place than they did. And I think that there's something wrong with that, why is that building the way it is? What successes happened there? Why is it, is it because it's an old technique, is it necessarily an inappropriate one? It might be a good technique that you can refine. So having an understanding of the history, if they want to take something away from it, that I think is what has made me, um, what I would hope to continue to be make a useful contribution, because I actually have a historical perspective on not only my career, but the zoo community or the zoo industry as a whole.
Yeah, fantastic note to finish on there, Doug. So a massive shout out to you for giving up your time to come and chat today. and just give us an insight onto what is a wealth of knowledge and experience. We'll be sure to keep up with your work, and I'd love to have you back on in the future, as there's plenty more to discuss. Thank you for your time, and we'll hopefully speak to you again soon.
You're very welcome. I'll be more than happy to come back.
A massive thank you to Doug once again for all his hard work in conservation and his time on the Conservationists Assemble podcast today. But as always, a huge thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. If you did enjoy this episode, please like, share and review or rate the podcast, as it helps us to keep improving and spreading the word on the conservation efforts taking place around the world. Don't forget that you can always follow and interact with the podcast on Instagram, Facebook or via email. I've been your host, Johnny Bloxham, and I hope to see you next time.